All right. Wonderful. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Jeannie Merrill. I'm the Executive Director of the Berkeley Food Institute, and I'm pleased to moderate today's Farm to School Program Evaluation webinar. I first have some housekeeping. We'll have time for, after the presentation, to answer any questions that you may have. You can also add your questions as they come in the Q&A, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. Today's webinar is the first of 3 webinars on the recent California Farm to School Evaluation Progress Report. We'll have more information about the webinar series at the end of our presentations today. I'm going to provide just a little bit of background on the work to date and introduce our speakers. Each of them will have about, they'll present for about 15-20 minutes, and then we'll have time for discussion. Some of you may know that California has made the largest state investment in farm to school programs, allocating approximately $100 million over 3 years since 2020. And to understand the impacts of the Farm to School Incubator Grant Program, the state of California has funded a multi-year evaluation. The interdisciplinary research team is tasked with providing a comprehensive analysis of the economic, environmental, and social impacts of the Farm to School Grant Program, including a final report that will be out at the end of 2026. The team includes researchers and policy experts from the UC Agriculture and Natural Resources Division, UC Berkeley, the Food Insight Group, the Berkeley Food Institute, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Today's webinar will highlight the initial farmer and rancher related findings of the evaluation team, and upcoming webinars will review the school and program implementation related findings. We're pleased to be joined today by 2 of the evaluation research team members. Yvonne Sokolar, our first presenter, works at UC Berkeley as a project scientist on the Farm to School environmental team. In addition to her work on the evaluation team, Dr. Sokolar has worked extensively with farmers on California's Central Coast, doing interviews and developing participatory research projects to better understand dry farming as an agroecological transition. Yvonne holds a PhD in agroecology from UC Berkeley and a master's in agriculture, food, and environment from Tufts University. Our second presenter today is Meg Reisler, who works in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management at UC Berkeley as a postdoctoral researcher on the Farm to School Case Studies team. Dr. Reisler holds a PhD and MS in agroecology from the University of Helsinki, Finland. And during their 7 years in Finland, they collaborated on a variety of environmental, social science, and food system transformation research projects with city planners, landscape architects, urban farmers, and human geographers, all with the shared goal of advancing agroecological and regenerative food systems. Dr. Sokolar, would you provide your first presentation?
Yeah, of course. Thanks so much, Amy. And let me know if you can't hear me or anything for any reason.
I hear you just fine.
Awesome. Great. So yeah, I wanted to start this off talking just more about who the producer grantees are in this program. And to preface even that by saying that I think this grant program is really exciting in that it includes producers as part of the farm to school system. I think in farm to school, the focus can often be more on school. So the fact that producers are getting grants is a really meaningful difference and change that is happening already with this grant program from the California Department of Food and Agriculture, which I'll refer to as CDFA. So with this Farm to School grant from CDFA, the producer grantees are farmers and ranchers. And that's one of the tracks that can be funded as part of the grant program. There's also schools, ECE, and distributors or supporting organizations. And Dr. Reisler will talk a little bit more about those with the case studies. But of course, our focus today is on producer grantees. And my focus is going to be on the second cohort of grantees. So there were 3 years of grants, 3 cohorts that are being awarded. And our focus today is on that second cohort. So 50 organizations, 50 producer organizations were awarded grants in that second cohort from 29 counties around the state. And we can go to the next slide. Great. So first I want to just start talking about some demographic information about both the applicants and the awarded grants. So looking at data from who applied and who was awarded the grants, you can see in the blue here, there's the percent of producers statewide who identify with each of these categories. And then that dark blue purple color shows the percent of producer applicants, and the green color shows the percent of cohort 2 producer grantees. So of those 70 applicants, what percent of the awarded grantees also identify with that category? And so the first thing to point out is that in every case, both the applicants and the producer grantees identify with these historically underrepresented groups at a higher rate than producers statewide, which is great. It seems like we're attracting a diverse pool of applicants. And also, for the most part, you can see that the people who are eventually awarded grants, the grantees in green there, reflect the applicant pool. There are, of course, a few exceptions you can see on the chart here. And where there are exceptions, I think it could indicate communities that might benefit from grant writing support or something to sort of connect those dots from putting in an application to actually getting awarded a grant. Sorry, we can say this for 1 second. Just looking at these numbers as a whole from a racial and a gender equity perspective, I think the grant program looks like it's generally doing a good job soliciting applicants and awarding grants. That compared to current statewide producer demographics, they're doing a good job. I also do want to note that there's still ways to go before these numbers reflect the demographics of like the full population of California. But we're still doing it, or CDFA is still doing a good job compared to the current state of affairs in terms of who actually are producers in the state right now. Okay, so that's producer identities. Also want to think about how they're farming. So producer grantees are using what I'm calling biodiversity-based farming practices at much higher rates than farmers statewide. And we'll look at the numbers themselves in a second, but first I want to explain why I'm using the term biodiversity-based here. So a term that might be more familiar or more common way to refer to these practices right now is climate smart agricultural practices. But here I really want to emphasize that the types of climate smart practices that these farmers are using require a more fundamental shift in farming systems compared to industrialized farming practices. So when I say biodiversity based, I mean that these farms are relying on both diversity in crops themselves and also farm ecosystems that are built around that diversity to grow healthy and resilient crops. So for example, that might mean like cycling through a diverse crop rotation as a way to disrupt pest pressures instead of applying pesticides, or it could mean growing cover crops that foster healthy microbial, soil microbial communities that can help plants acquire nutrients. And these biodiversity-based farming practices are like fundamentally different from using, say, drip tape to irrigate or installing solar panels, which are also climate smart practices, but they're more plug and play. They can plug into pretty much any kind of farming system, whereas what we're seeing farmers doing here are a larger shift in the full farming system. So producer grantees are relying on these biodiversity-based farming practices and farming systems to grow crops, and they're doing it in some cases at a much higher rate than the average California farmer. So you can see with cover cropping, that's the very top row right here, 66% of grantees who, like it says of possible producer grantees, because I'm, for example, not counting the ranchers in the denominator here, but 66% of the producers who conceivably could be using this practice are using this practice compared to 14% statewide. So much higher implementation of cover cropping. That's also definitely true for low and reduced tillage. So starting to see patterns just in who these farmers and farms are in the first place, that they're leaning into these more biodiversity-based farming practices and systems. Let me go to the next slide. So with demographics, we talked about who these producers are. we've seen in terms of practices, how they're farming. And I also want to just touch on what is the farming experience like for them. So these are the most common challenges that producers reported experiencing in the 5 years prior to receiving the grant. And these data come from interviews that I did with all of the cohort 2 producer grantees last fall. So of the 50 producers, I was able to talk to 46 of them. And we had conversations about what was the farm like leading up to the grant, what they're planning to do with the grant, how things are changing around their farms. And the 3 most common challenges that producer grantees mentioned leading up to receiving the grant were infrastructure, markets and marketing, and financing. So just to get a better sense of what I mean when I say these terms, an illustrative example of an infrastructure challenge. One farmer said, where we've been doing all our packing and stuff is under a tent that flies away in the wind, and we have to replace it constantly. So just these small pieces of infrastructure that if you're trying to pack up all your food and distribute it out to schools or other markets, and all of a sudden your tent keeps flying away, it's really disruptive and can cause a big challenge. For markets and marketing, an illustrative quote was a farmer who said, "The easiest part for us is growing the produce. Then the hardest part is finding where to put the produce." So you might find producers who are really good at the farm production side of things, but don't necessarily have the business degree that comes with actually marketing and distributing the food that they're producing. And then finally, for financing, a farmer said, "We don't really make enough money selling produce because that's not really what the goal is. The goal is to teach kids to eat healthy and to introduce more fruits and vegetables." So in some cases, and many of the producer grantees are nonprofits or educationally focused in some way. So they don't necessarily make enough money just purely from selling produce to fund the whole mission and vision of the organization. And even for just the more sort of classic businesses, finding financing to make improvements that's obviously related to these infrastructure challenges, financing can become quite difficult. We can go to the next slide. So that was a little snapshot of who producer grantees are and what their farms were like before the grant kicked in. And now I want to talk more about what it's been like for these producers to get the grant and to participate in farm to school programs more broadly. So in these slides coming up here, I want to separate out the impacts of the farm to school program generally versus the grant impacts specifically. So things that have been a direct result of the grant, like what has come out of spending grant money or being involved in the grant program, is what I'll call grant impacts. And then what's been an impact of farm to school involvement. So in other words, that could be like what has come out of getting involved in school markets and educational programming, things that you can do with the farm to school program without necessarily getting a grant in the first place. That'll be the farm to school impacts. And of course, there's overlap between the two. Some get counted as both a grant impact and a farm to school impact, but I think it's helpful to think about these as 2 separate categories because obviously the grant is necessary for one, but not necessarily the other. And we can go to the next slide. So starting off, the farm to school impacts generally, and this was especially easy to see in producers that had already been involved in farm to school programs before this grant program started. We can see that farm to school just by itself has important implications for markets. So of the 46 producers I interviewed, 29 said that farm to school opened up markets for them in some way. So for example, one producer said, "There's certainly been a lot of interest from food service directors to purchase apples, and our biggest account would be a school district that they named. And they, with some exceptions, will buy 30 bushels a week, which is big in our county." So an example of schools becoming important markets for these producers. Farm to School has also created network connections for these producers. So there are schools that have contacted us and just emailed us out of the blue or phoned us out of the blue. So the Farm to School program is causing schools to start reaching out to producers more often. And there are also other network connections that I won't talk about directly today, unless there are questions, happy to answer them. But it's not just farms to schools, but also farms to farms and farms to distributors. And maybe Meg will talk a little bit more about that too. And then finally, in terms of education, an obvious farm to school impact, but also that producers are experiencing as well. So folks who have kids out to the farms who are saying their kids are getting exposed to new vegetables because we have a lot of heirloom varieties and things. They've never seen Romanesco. Oh my gosh, Romanesco. And Meg, if you go to the next slide, we can all see Romanesco is amazing and fun. And if you've never seen that or experienced it growing before, having kids out to farms has these important educational impacts. All right, next slide. So in terms of the impacts that are more specific to the grant that producers have been experiencing, network connections has been especially huge. So as one producer said, we were able to get most of everything that they wanted and deliver it to them. And that was super awesome to be able to have, not just as a check mark for a grant deliverable, but as a foot in the door. So this is a producer who's getting connected to a school, specifically through the grant, and that is awesome, of course, as a grant deliverable, but also it's going to get down to the bottom row here of markets and marketing of those network connections lead to tangible changes for these producers as well. In terms of infrastructure, lots of just daily nitty-gritty parts of farm infrastructure that people are finally able to get funding for and support. So we had our parking lot asphalted to be able to run pallet jacks and move things around more easily. Things that don't immediately seem connected to farm to school, but if you can process things more quickly and at larger scales, it is much more smooth to be involved in these farm to school supply chains. And then in terms of markets and marketing, of course, particularly with this grant, we've noticed this year, there's quite an acceleration of interest. So it's not necessarily even just the producers themselves getting these grants that are helping increase markets and marketing, but schools, when they get these grants, are then reaching more out to farmers and producers, and there's been this acceleration of interest. Okay, so then we were also interested to see how and in what ways this grant was actually able to address the most pressing challenges that farmers reported facing before receiving the grant. So we can go down to the next one here. And just to get you all oriented here, on the left, there's all of the challenges that all of the producers that I talked to reported experiencing. And you can see how many of those organizations reported experiencing the challenge listed in the first column of numbers there. And then in the next column, it shows if a farmer reported experiencing that challenge, did they also then report that challenge as a grant impact, or that topic as a grant impact? And then the final column is, did they also report that as that topic as a farm to school impact? So for example, with land access in the middle here, you can see that there are 20 producers who reported experiencing challenges with land access in their interviews. And then of those 20 farms or farms and ranches, 5 of them also reported that land access was an impact of the grant, and 4 of those producers, 4 of the 20, reported that land access was an impact from farm to school more generally. So I think this is especially interesting to look at what the areas of alignment are where the grant and/or farm to school is doing a good job of addressing producers' main challenges. So first of all, with markets and marketing, we can see that we already know is one of the most common challenges that producers are facing. And the numbers of producers who report this as a grant impact and a farm to school impact are high. And that's exciting and great because these are producers who are looking for more markets, who have trouble sometimes finding places to distribute their produce to. And they're saying that, yes, this grant program is actually leading to improvements in markets and being able to find a home for their products. If you go to the next, there's also, in terms of infrastructure, the numbers of grantees who are reporting infrastructure as something that the grant was able to address is also high, and also makes sense. When you get grant funding, it's easy to use that to build or buy new infrastructure. So that is also another important area of alignment in the grant here. And then I also want to talk a little bit about, one other thing that I wanted to mention here is that it's also exciting to see that whereas with markets and marketing, it seems like both the grant and farm to school are helping and leading to these outcomes. With infrastructure, the grant was much better at doing this than connections with farm to school in general. So this is an instance where the grant itself was really important to allowing these farms and ranches build new infrastructure.
And Yvonne,
okay,
I just wanted to give you a time check of 5 minutes.
Yes, great, thank you. So moving on to the next slide, I also want to talk about these areas that it looks like the grant or farm to school have difficulty addressing. So for distribution, receiving a fair price for produce, and also schools' capacity to actually process or use or connect with producers. These are all areas where people reported experiencing challenges, and the ability for the grant or farm to school to actually address that seemed pretty low. So important to note areas where the grant can't necessarily be as helpful as we might like it to be, or at least isn't being so helpful so far. And then if we go to the next one, we can also see that in at least the case of seasonality, it seems like the grant in some ways is actually exacerbating a challenge. So seasonality here, you can think of how in farms, for the most part, the growing season is over the summer, and that tends to be when schools are not in season or not in session. And so there's already the seasonality question that farmers struggle with just in terms of having seasonal markets, and it gets exacerbated when you get connected with schools, because the time when your produce is the most abundant is the time when schools aren't necessarily using it at all. And then I just wanted to end here by circling back to the main challenges that are the most commonly reported challenges that producers were experiencing, and highlight, going to the last slide here, or sorry, if we go to the next slide, Meg. Yeah, so these are the main challenges for infrastructure, markets and marketing, and financing. And then if you look back with the last slide, we can see that these were the areas that were actually the most successful with the grant program. So these are the top 3 grant impacts, were also the top 3 challenges that producers reported experiencing. So we wouldn't expect one grant or one program to be a silver bullet, but the fact that it seems like the grant and farm to school in general are meaningfully addressing these 3 main challenges is a really big deal for these producers, and something that we're excited to continue to track and see where it goes. So I will stop here, and I think we might have time if there's 1 or 2 clarifying questions, and then I'll pass it over to Dr. Ressler.
Yeah, if there are any clarifying questions, you can go ahead and put that in the Q&A. We'll give people a moment here. Okay, I'm not seeing any clarifying questions, so let's go ahead and have Dr. Ressler go ahead and do your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, great. Hello, everybody. Yeah, thanks for being here today. It's exciting to see so much interest in this topic. And thanks, Dr. Sokolar, for starting us off and yeah, sharing lots of numbers. I have more words to share with you, fewer numbers. But yeah, as Jeannie said, I'm Meg Ressler. I'm a postdoc at UC Berkeley, and I am one of 4 folks working on the case studies small group of the larger evaluation team. So the other 3 being Christy Getz, Gornell Engelskirchen, and Gail Feenstra. So what I would like to do with our time today is to just briefly introduce our approach on the case studies team and and kind of how it differs from the work that Dr. Sokolar is doing, kind of with a more producer-focused approach. And then I have one case that I'd like to talk through with you to provide some more context to one of those challenges that Dr. Sokolar mentioned with markets and marketing, and kind of put that into perspective, how one specific producer grantee from the who was awarded a grant in 2022 from the Farm to School Incubator Grant Program, kind of what strategies they use to navigate that challenge with markets and marketing, and how grant dollars played a role in that strategy. So that's the plan. Okay, so our case studies approach. First, I think I'll offer a definition of a case study supply chain, what I mean when I say that. Really what we're doing is we're taking the supply chain as our unit of analysis and taking a step back and looking holistically at the various pathways local food can take to get from its source to students, whether that's in the cafeteria, on a tray, or in a classroom, or in a school garden, or even on a farm. The various kind of procurement pathways that can take. So one example of a farm to school supply chain would be a direct procurement relationship between a farmer selling directly to a school district or a charter school. This may be very familiar to some of you in this group, but another pathway could be an intermediated relationship where that food travels from the producer via a food hub or a distributor or a co-op, and then makes its way to a school district. There is one more actor in the supply chain, which you'll see in this diagram here in the bottom, who we are referring to as a supporting organization. And this essentially refers to any community-based group, could be a nonprofit, could be a county office of education, anyone working really to help facilitate these different types of purchasing relationships and help make farm to school sales happen. So this could be someone helping make introductions between farmers and ranchers and food service directors, or someone assisting with TA, helping farmers navigate becoming a vendor for school districts that process, or answering questions about how to bid, or food safety requirements, that sort of thing. So these are really the four kind of main actor groups we are kind of working with in our case studies. In practice, what this has looked like is my colleague Gwenelle and I have conducted about 90 interviews with actors across California in the last year, about evenly split between actors from these four groups, to learn more about how the 2022 grant, the funded 2022 grant projects have, how it's been going, what factors along the supply chains have really helped these actors do the farm to school work they really want to do. As Dr. Sokolar mentioned, what are the challenges they're facing, and also what are the persistent challenges that maybe this grant program itself can't tackle, or isn't tackling, but what is it tackling, and what is it doing well? So those interviews, as I mentioned, have been conducted with actors across the state, connected to 20 of the funded grant projects. And those were grant projects where, as Dr. Sokolar mentioned, some of those the awarded grants went directly to farmers via track 4. But there were also other tracks where some of those awards went to school districts, some went to aggregators, and some went to supporting organizations. So included in our case study, we've included cases where actors from all across the supply chain were actually at the receiving end of the grant money, and kind of how those impacts vary depending on where the grant funding is infused along the supply chain. So that is a broad overview of what we've been working on. I'd like to now just walk through one specific example, one case of a farmer grantee who was awarded one of these grants in 2022. And yeah, provide, as I mentioned, just provide a little more context, a real life lived experience example of how one particular farmer in one farming community who has been struggling with this common challenge of access to markets and marketing in the school food market, how they have navigated this challenge since being awarded the grant in 2022. So a little bit of context to set the scene. This farmer grantee, they have a small operation, about 5 acres, where they they're certified organic and cultivate with organic practices. They grow vegetables, many types, diversified cropping system. And previously, before this grant program, their main market had been selling at farmers markets. So this isn't the whole story, but if we're going to focus on one challenge this farmer has faced is just accessing the farm to school market. They have had a desire to sell to school districts. They've, in theory, liked the idea of having more consistent sales with schools than they have at farmers markets, and are intrigued by the idea of selling at a higher volume, which school districts tend to want to purchase at a higher volume than farmers markets. So they've been intrigued, but have just been, confronting this barrier to entry with accessing the market. Kind of as Dr. Sokolar mentioned in that quote, the easy bit is growing the produce. The hardest part is figuring out where it can go. So that was the case for this farmer, not knowing who to contact in their community, which school districts to approach, how the distribution logistics would work, how to navigate the vendor process, what food safety requirements were necessary, all of that. And another aspect to accessing the farm to school market in this community, many farmers in this community, language has emerged as a significant barrier to accessing the market. So in this case, farmers and food service directors may not have a shared working language, which is a significant barrier to entry. So summarizing all of this farmer, the grantee, explained it's so hard. For example, how am I going to get to that school? And during the interview, they pointed to a school which we could clearly see half a mile away from the parcel of land they lease, say, like, they don't know that I'm here, I'm just a mile or so away. Kind of illustrating that even if, the desire is there, just entering the market is a real challenge. So I wanted to share a couple of strategies that emerged in this region to help navigate this challenge. And some of these interventions were grant funded, and others were interventions led by the community, not connected or not funded by the grant project. So about a year before this farmer was awarded the 2022 grant, they were instrumental in forming a co-op with other farmers and other organic farmers in their community. And the mindset before forming the co-op was, one person can't do it alone. In the wake of COVID, the region was really struggling, and this farmer had the attitude of, I can't do it alone, but maybe together we can. And specifically regarding the school food market, the thinking was, on my 5 acres, I can't may not be able to produce at a volume that a school district would wish to procure at, but perhaps if we pool our produce together, it might be possible. So this co-op formed, and a year later, the farmer was awarded the Farm to School grant. And those grant funds went to a couple places. So on one hand, the grant funds were used to procure organic produce from co-op members, and then was donated to that nearby school site that I mentioned that you can see from the farmer's land parcel. And so that food ended up in cafeterias in the form of salads, and students were even engaged with the harvesting and wash packing and the preparation of those salads, and had to navigate the process of acquiring food handlers permits. And so this was one aspect of the work. Grant funds were also used to essentially subcontract a community-based support organization who played an instrumental role in offering culturally responsive assistance to the farmer grantee and the other co-op members, to essentially help this support this group in developing a peer support network, building the scaffolding for that network, and then also building other relationships in the community with other food service directors across the region and making those introductions. So kind of summarizing all of this work, a representative from that supporting organization explained, the co-op meets weekly, and during every one of those meetings, held in Spanish at their own pace, sometimes in conflict, they work through the logistical pieces that are necessary to make this project work. So yeah, working together in this peer learning network to navigate some of those challenges with accessing the farm to school market. And this particular grant cycle is still ongoing, so there likely will be future additional impacts from this grant project that we don't know yet. But at least from my last interview with someone in the supply chain earlier this year, there were a few significant impacts. So the first of which is, of course, the food that was purchased from the organic produce purchased from the co-op members that ended up as meals for students in a nearby school district. There was the nutrition, the hands-on nutrition education impacts of the students working with the harvesting and preparation of those salads. And then a slightly less direct impact was that 3 co-op members at the time of my last interview had also become vendors for other nearby school districts. So these are new procurement relationships that have the potential to continue past the past the end of this particular grant project, which actors in the supply chain contributed specifically to the work of this particular grant project and the relationships that the supporting organization helped to build in the region. So kind of explaining, tying all of this up, that same representative from the supporting organization explained, every time I think of it, I get teary when I think that the farmer who was awarded the grant hosted 2 food nutrition directors at his farm, gave them a tour, and then they left convinced they need to sign a contract for this next school year to purchase cherry tomatoes and snap peas. So that's a snapshot of this case. If you're interested to learn more about other aspects of this case, we do spotlight the case in the first progress report that Jeannie mentioned, which is available online. There are also two other cases we spotlight in that report that provide some more context to those other challenges Dr. Sokolar mentioned specifically with infrastructure and distribution and financing, markets and marketing. There's a lot of information there if you want to know more. So that's what I have for you. And yeah, Jeannie, are we going to open it up to some questions now?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Thanks so much. We have a couple of questions to start in the Q&A, and I wonder, Yvonne and Meg, if in sort of in response, if you have, I'll read those out maybe just briefly and would welcome your responses, and then encourage anyone else to add any questions that they may have to the Q&A, or you're welcome to also raise your hand, and I can unmute you and you can ask your question as well. But first, from Yuka, we have four different questions about sort of, do buyers, school districts crop plan with farmers? That's one. You've seen that. And then also, how have small farmers, we have 5 acres, worked with schools when most school nutrition services do not have the capacity to process vegetables, and the farms also don't have that capacity. And then the third question, maybe we'll, how have past grantees navigated seasonality and continued to work with schools during summer and sort of the off season? Yeah, so welcome any thoughts, reactions to that set of questions.
Well, I can jump in first. Let's see, with the question regarding crop planning, I think this is something that has come up in several of my interviews. It's something that I think several producers are wanting to try, and in some cases have been. I think what I've heard is instead of maybe they've planted more of certain crops that schools are really interested in buying, like strawberries and snap peas. Dr. Sokolar, you probably know more about this, so please jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, first of all, a great question. I think it's a huge area of opportunity for schools to actually get involved with these crop plans and help make a whole system that works for everyone. And also, I can think of a couple of cool examples of this starting a little bit, and I think that more commonly schools just sort of say, this is what we need, or this is what we want, and then farmers crop plan around that. So less of like a collaborative menu creation and more of a, if you can work this in, then that would be great. But also still great to hear in advance that if you can work something in, it'll actually get purchased. There have been a couple, I don't know if you want to talk at all about with like food hubs, how that's been helping with sort of communication on both ends at all. But yeah, I would say it's there a little bit, but would be really exciting to see more.
And on the question of sort of capacity of processing, and when there isn't capacity either on the school side or on the farm side, how have you seen how that's being addressed?
I've heard about a few examples of some kind of creative problem solving to address this very widespread issue or challenge. There are other funding channels specifically, targeting investments in kitchen and infrastructure and training. So the KIT funds, that's one of them. I think a lot of school districts around the state are using those funds to help expand their processing capacity. Whether or not that addresses the issue of being able to hire and retain enough staff to actually do the processing, that's another question. I've also, I know there's one producer grantee from the 2022 grant cycle who was awarded a grant to build a wash pack facility. And then they've, the hope is with that, then they'll share access to that facility with other small farmers in their area. I know some food hubs are partnering with processors to help essentially hire processors to do some of that chopping and packing and creating products that are ready to eat for schools. Yeah, so there are all sorts of solutions.
Right. And then on the question of sort of seasonality, has that come up in the interviews? And how do you think farmers are addressing that?
Yeah, I think a couple answers. One is that there still are some institution or school institutional food purchasing that happens over the summer. So like summer meals programs, it doesn't go completely to zero. So that is definitely something. And then also I have talked to a couple firms who are also now getting interested in other institutional markets. So like hospitals or like prisons, other places that could sort of serve as a institutional stopgap over the summer. And then it is also true that, you know, summers are often a time when farmers markets are going strong, you know, like there can be non-institutional pathways that can sort of soak up a lot of the produce that is getting produced over the summer. So it's, you know, certainly it's still a major challenge that folks are facing. And also, I think that there are, like the markets can shift around to some extent to make the whole system work.
Yeah, great. I wanted to respond to Annie's question about grant writing workshops. That's run by the California Department of Food and Agriculture to provide technical assistance for the Farm to School Incubator Grant Program. So that's not the research team who we have here today. But I will say that CDFA does not have a current open call for applications. The next round of funding will be determined in the next state budget, the governor and sort of legislative process. So there isn't currently new funding available, but that will be determined in the next budget cycle, which will be finalized by roughly June of next year. So there aren't any current grant writing workshops available through the Department of Food and Agriculture. But if this is a program that you're interested in, I encourage you to go to the CDFA website. They also have regional technical service providers who are good people to get in touch with, who can also answer your questions more directly about the grant program. And then also just encourage more people to feel free to add questions to the Q&A, but we have another one here from Yuka about Meg, your example of farmers coming together as a co-op to address some of the economies of scale and share resources. But if perhaps a co-op isn't an option in a farmer's region, are there other kind of creative strategies that you all have seen in the course of doing your interviews of farmers coming together? I know food hubs certainly are also part of the program. So yeah, I was curious if you could offer any other examples.
Yeah, working with the food hub, if that's available in your region, that's the idea that came to my mind first. Yeah.
Yeah, I think something also that Jeannie already mentioned, but talking to the regional leads has been really huge. I think that they're sort of acting as, you know, it's not a full like cooperative in the sense that some of these producers are making, but they have a lot of knowledge about what's happening with grantees, both schools and other producers. And so they can help connect people, even if you don't have the capacity to start a full co-op. If you're like, well, I have lettuce, but not quite enough to make this full order. Maybe there's another producer in the area who has some. The regional leads I've heard have been quite helpful in terms of just serving as a network keystone to get all of these actors in place.
Yeah. Great. Any other questions? Yuka, I see that your hand is raised. You can, you should be able to speak if you want to go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much. I learned about this series yesterday, and I was really happy that I could attend. So thank you, and also thank you for your answers thus far. Um, I just wanted to um, clarify a little bit about the seasonality, and maybe just like workshop more with y'all because you've obviously done a lot of research on this. But so in response to wanting to be climate smart and bio sensitive and also just like respect the land, we don't farm in the winter, and so we do cover cropping from basically like November to May, which is almost aligns exactly with the school season. um and so it obviously results in some issues in terms of what we can offer the school districts. And I know that we're not the only farm doing this. It's like a pretty common organic practice in the winter. And so I was wondering if that's something that you've also come across in your interviews with farmers, and if they have any recommendations, especially since right now we don't have any capacity for winter storage. I know that once we start building more infrastructure, that'll become easier, but right now we can't like store apples over the winter or anything like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll just start by saying that, like, absolutely, yes, this is a real challenge and real struggle. And unfortunately, like everything you're saying is true, and there's not an easy answer to it. I will say that just from what I've seen talking to producers, it certainly is possible just to sell in, August, September, October, especially with like harvest of the month kind of programs, or, like there's ways to plug into more one-off kinds of things rather than just like supplying lettuce for the salad bar year round. And food service directors, I think, at least in some cases, are plugged into seasonally what's available, and might seek out produce at times when it actually will be around. And then the only other thing I was thinking of that you already mentioned is, yeah, if you can use the grant to then improve cold storage and you have those sort of more shelf-stable products, then that is another option. I've also seen farmers doing things like using the grant funds to make like tunnels or greenhouses that they can actually use to grow produce in the winter, or folks who are still growing crops to some extent over the course of the winter and rotate where they're actually cover cropping versus where they're doing a more continuous cropping system. But yeah, I feel like none of that is an especially satisfying answer because it is a really hard challenge.
Yeah, great. Let's see, we have a few questions here, and I'll just point out that Yuka, there's a response to one of your questions in the Q&A from Kat, so please check that out. And then Erin asks if we've had any contact with farmers who've been frustrated with having to dispose of what they've grown because they couldn't find a market for it. And if so, how have they addressed this issue?
I can very quickly respond to this one and just say that so far what we've seen is actually that, if anything, the grant is preventing food waste rather than creating it. For example, if you're growing smaller apples, like tiny humans love tiny apples. And so there's markets that have been actually created for what otherwise would have been food waste. So no, I haven't personally heard of the school market falling through and a farmer needing to dispose of that food.
Great. And then we have another question about if we know if producer grantees are taking advantage of other funding programs offered to funders, so stacking programs. Do they find themselves unable to access other funds, whether it's CDFA or USDA?
What I've been hearing from food service directors is there's a lot of grants available, a lot of different funding streams out there that they're playing with to try and to make it all work. So the KIT funds that I mentioned, local food for schools, what else? LFPP. There's a lot available.
I think, and also on the farmer side, we're seeing them
Yeah.
participating in CDFA's climate smart ag programs when funding is available. Yeah.
Yeah, so things like the Healthy Soil Program, we've certainly seen a fair amount of overlap there. And then also the Urban Ag Grant that I think that came out a year or two ago. So yeah, there generally seem to be less grants on the producer side of things and the school side of things, but also there has certainly been, and also with USDA grants that might overlap with the state level programming. So yes.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. I've put in the chat a link to CDFA, more on the program. Also put a link in the chat to the progress report. This is really a progress report. So there'll be another report in a year from now as an interim, and then the final evaluation report will be out at the end of 2026. And then if you're interested in the upcoming webinars, which will address more of the findings, initial findings on the school end of things, or on the sort of CDFA application process itself, please go ahead and check out those events listed on the Berkeley Food Institute website. But thank you all so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you at the upcoming webinars. Bye now.